Michael Garfield. It's an honor to welcome you back to the podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation today about the topic of UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, and perhaps also disclosure in the same breath. There's so many ways to open into this. You and I both have an interest in philosophy. I think in your case, philosophy of science particularly. You're also an evolutionary thinker, the background in evolutionary biology. You're an artist. You've run a podcast and worked and collaborated and thought with very interesting people over more than a decade across topics that require taking a very broad view and at the same time really holding yourself to a deep rigor for engaging that. And I also enjoy that kind of thinking, enjoy that kind of engaging with the world. So you really are one of the people I'd most like to go deep into this topic with. And you're also an experiencer of these phenomena. That's not something I myself am, although people who I'm close to are. And, I take their experiences very seriously. We both share an interest in psychedelics and consciousness studies, for whatever that means and whatever that's worth. And so in terms of the intensity and strangeness and mystery and frontier of understanding that whole world invokes, there are some meaningful overlaps and perhaps meaningful meta perspectives, philosophies, ontologies, epistemologies, ethics, aesthetics, so much that goes into relating with the phenomena. And so we'll see what can come together today. And with that said, with respect to the topic of UAP and disclosure, how do you approach it in your attempt to make sense over these years? What frames, what lenses do you bring?
Well, you meet the strange where you are, right? And so I think it's right to observe that at the time of my first UFO encounters as an adult, I was freshly graduated from an undergraduate program in evolutionary biology. I was at a turning point in my life where what I thought I was doing and had monomaniacally committed to for, at that point, 23 years had started to fall apart. And the paleontological field crew that I was utterly committed to working with was unraveling due to political infighting. The PhD letters I was sending in for application to various schools, I never even sent because I had fallen in love with somebody who still had a couple of years of school ahead of her. And I was reading transpersonal psychology and had started taking psychedelics, and I think importantly also had started finding papers that really opened me up to much bigger questions about biology and consciousness. And I was kind of possessed with the multi-perspectival fundamental intelligence research, fundamental consciousness research. I had been reading Ken Wilber and doing shadow work and starting to think about where there were, evolutionary directionality, which I think for most people is still kind of a taboo. The idea that there is a telos was squeezed out of the conversation in evolutionary biology a long time ago. But it started leaking back in with complex systems science, in as much as there started to be a formal framework around thinking about self-organization and the emergence of the complex from the simple, and its relationship to major evolutionary transitions. Also, this notion that, an organism is an encoding of the stable variables of its environment. And so, like, what are those environmental drivers that would basically require an organism to evolve in its intelligence? And I bring all this stuff up because I think that we will have come to a point in the conversation where all of this stuff happening at the time of these sightings becomes very pertinent. It wasn't at the time, but I think the more that I think about high weirdness or the phenomenon, the more it's a kind of a case study and, a developmental crucible. It's an instance of the kind of things that I was starting to grope toward intellectually at that time, in as much as, Paul Tillich, his 1973 term, the ontological shock, that we have these experiences that demand we rise to an occasion, that demand we develop ourselves to a higher logical order. And that's an instance in the life of a person that is structurally akin to the same kind of phenomenon that's going on in major evolutionary transitions in life, like the origin of multicellularity or the emergence of syntactic language. These kinds of things where there's an information scaling crisis that is met with a new encoding of the complexity of that situation. So I guess I'm more or less just performing a perspective, which is that, like, thinking in a multi and meta perspectival way is now something I've been doing for 20 plus years. But at the time, it was very new to me, and I think that those experiences were kind of an initiation into what who eventually became my graduate advisor, my friend Sean S. Bjorn Hargens, his work in particular was really deeply informative to me in, trying to think about how to do what you're doing now, which is to address a truth claim by opening the aperture of the conversation beyond, intersubjective second person validation focuses on the what that two people perceive. And then third person validation, the modern turn is a turn into the inclusion of methodology. It's the reproducible experiment. And now we're getting into something that I think the world is crazy enough that we, for the last several decades, we've started developing a deeper appreciation, including in like the linguistic turn in postmodern philosophy, in including who is doing the talking in the multidimensional address of whatever it is we might say about the world. So he and Ken Wilber had come up with this, that we can't say anything without including the who, the how, and the what. and they had a integral metaperspectival calculus for that. And the experiences that I had certainly challenged me in as much as I needed a meta framework like that in order to hold them. And like, I needed when I had Sean on the old version of my show, Future Fossils, that he introduced me to the idea of the Buddhist tetralemma, where something can be true, false, both true and false, and neither true nor false, and that's, I love that. And I love that a system as capacious as his makes space for that. And, later when I had him back on, once he was finally out of the closet, to talk about his own sort of meta theory around the UFO phenomenon, it's that kind of thinking that allows us to do a deeper study of this stuff without getting hung up on the mechanistic framework that we're bringing into it. Sean is an ontological pluralist. He really maintains that different structures of reality are co-enacted by different structures of selfhood. And I think that that's been a huge influence to me in the way that I sit with the mystery of this stuff. That said, lately, it has started coming into focus. I've been listening to Disclosure stuff now for ages as almost a guilty pleasure. You don't know who to trust, and you don't know what is what. And can you hear my kids?
Couple aliens in the house.
Well, that's a whole thing. Talking about my kids as aliens, it's hard for me to separate, there's a huge category of stuff when you say weird stuff that includes hauntings and precognition and
right.
all of this stuff. And I've had those experiences as well. I saw very vividly, I saw my children years before they were born. I knew I was going to have these particular kids. Wow. Or at least I had such a compelling vision of them that in the years that the woman who is now my wife and I could not get our act together, I was very did I lose my mind? What were those visions? Why was I seeing these kids if I'm not going to have them? And, it's also worth noting that the UFO experiences I had at that time, the most impactful of numerous, were on the heels of me working through this bizarre situation of living with my former college roommates in a haunted house, in a poltergeist situation. And that piece of it, which sort of resolved in, trying to banish this thing that was keeping my roommates up at night and slamming doors and so on, resulted in the vandalization of my car. It was it seemed to all of us as though it had been a kind of retaliatory act by this thing that was, this ominous presence in our house. And also like broke in the front door of our house and ripped down the bells that we had used. Whoever broke the front door, and this is like one of those things. It's like the least effort story is not necessarily the correct story, but like nothing was broken except the front boundary to our house, all the glass in the front door, and the bells that we had used to try to banish this thing the night before. And and so I had done some work on Gestalt psychotherapy and like shadow work to try. It was like I recognized about a month later a felt presence, like the presence of this thing in our house while I was somewhere else. And I was like, the house isn't haunted, I'm haunted. And so I went through this procedure of describing it in the third person as I had been taught by Terry Pratton at the Integral Institute, play acting a dialogue with it. And then after asking it what its name is and what it's trying to teach me and so on, and like the same protocol that you use if you're having a series of disturbing nightmares, or someone is really bothering you, someone is triggering you. After that, you're like, well, I just played both parts in my imaginary dialogue, so it's me. And as soon as I did that, the haunting stopped. And so for a long time, I thought that this was just some sort of splinter of my own psyche, which begs all sorts of questions about how, like Jung's psychoid phenomena, the way he described the UFO, which is like, it's neither purely mind nor matter, that there is this third category where, some kind of emotional distress that adolescents and young adults typically go through, as I started looking into the literature around poltergeists, expresses it in physical violence in their environments. It's a very characteristic thing in the literature around this stuff. How is that possible? Unless you open this whole other can of worms around stuff like telekinesis. And I mean, that's, and it was only after going through that stuff that 4 different groups of friends over the course of a year came out with me to this lake, and also a control group. One time we tried to bring a camera and nothing showed, but the other 4 times that we went out to this lake after I had watched the 2001 Press Club conference held by the Disclosure Project and was thinking about UFOs, started seeing them in the sky and started having, interactions with them. And I can't speak to what exactly my friends went through there, but like I personally felt like the content of those experiences was tailored to me as somebody with training in evolutionary biology and as somebody with training in transpersonal psych. And I, just to cut way ahead to the very many interesting people I met at Contact in the Desert, of which there were numerous working academics and private researchers who were involved in, field biology or life extension research or, the study of death and dying. Like there are lots of people there who said that their own contact experiences took on this kind of a character where their life, in the same way that a sort of a near-death experience casts everything in your life into focus, makes sense of the way that all of your disparate moments throughout your story fit together, that there's a sort of, you having had this particular life history, and also, you know, you go into the experiencer literature around this, and it's not just an individual life history thing. It's there. It seems like, you know, contact is an intergenerational phenomenon that tends to be experienced by the family as a basic unit. We can come back to that, but that there is this thing about, like, you know, due to your genetics and your specific set of traumas and your, you know, the books you've read and so on, like, this is how it's going to go for you. You know, these are the things that this is the interface. These are the things that we are capable of saying. You know, and to this day, I am still very uncomfortable talking about this stuff. I want to be more transparent about it because it feels like we're at a point in the development of Western culture where it is the right thing to do to be honest about one's weird experiences, because they're not weird for most of the cultures that have ever lived. And yet I've spent much of my adult life trying to play it straight with this stuff, you know, working inside elite scientific and technological institutions among people with very earthly concerns, and in spaces where having this kind of experience that so radically shifts your concept of the possible, you risk becoming a kind of Girardian scapegoat, you know, of like, you know, like an other within your own group. And nobody loves that.
That, I think, is shifting now. That to me feels like it's shifting. I can't remember with too much clarity, but I'd say it was probably the case that 7-8 years ago, when I began recording podcasts publicly, I would have felt that speaking about psychedelics was, you know, on the edge and interesting, but that UAPs was just too far out there. That's probably what I would have felt like. Now, of course, I came in touch with people who were interested in these things, but I remember even still, one of the tropes that seemed to be quite present among, you know, so construed psychedelic culture was that at some conference late at night, there were some people who were sharing their experiences. And all of a sudden it was sort of like psychedelics were just a bit of an opening. But then there was this whole other category of thing where it becomes a different order of social phenomena to relate with. Because of course, in the psychedelic context, particularly when it comes to academia, there are obviously silos where one is more free to speak of their expertise than others. And wherever you look, there's something which is just too far beyond the pale or might be thought weird or antithetical to speaking about publicly in order to build a career. And that's not the case for everyone, but by and large. But that, I think, has shifted. And it's interesting how you say that these experiences, you know, aren't weird. Just to give my sense of that, there are podcasts listened to by millions of people that are, well, quite possible for tens of millions of people to follow along to. These are mostly communicating in story. They're not necessarily bringing out deep tensions and contradictions and mediating them in ways that end in the kind of question that both interviewer and guest are actually stumped by. They usually maintain the frame of expert authority, and we don't actually want to challenge that too much unless we want to be super aggressive like a Mehdi Hassan, where it's all about the attack and defense and you're watching a different kind of spectacle. And so podcasts with millions of listeners tuning in at a fairly mainstream level, listening to such characters as the man who channels their entity Bashar,
Yeah.
many others, right? And so there's actually something altogether remarkably normal, right, now about something which is tremendously weird. The social phenomena of more or less just, hey, well, you're having these channeling experiences. Take the next 2 hours and relay your channeled wisdom as to the fate of humanity and what we most need to do. But mind you, as I just duck into the next ad break, right, at every 12-minute juncture, right, to sell you some supplement. So it's such an interesting contrast between just the norms of attentional capitalism in relation to what is remarkably weird and yet is so normalized. Now, I don't offer that as a critique necessarily, just to point to a certain sea change. And, I think at the level of opening into understanding as such, right, of reality and who and what we are and what influences us, what our limitations are, what's possible to communicate, what mediums of communication exist that we are aware of, and that perhaps we are unaware of. To me, it's becoming more and more table stakes not to just strong arm out the phenomena of UAP and the alien as such, if we want to really open up and engage. Now, obviously, there's plenty of topics which don't require a preface of what's your take on UAPs. That's not quite what I mean. But there's a lot here that I think intersects and interweaves. And, we could begin to offer a basic set of categorizations about how to relate to the phenomena in general. And you gave that. I won't be able to recall each line of the Buddhist stanza, that true, not true, and all the rest of it. But a number of truths may be the case. And all of those truths are tremendously confounding. So at the level of, and this won't be sufficient as a reduction of the category, but let's say at the level of we're just doing it to ourselves, or rather, we're doing it to each other. And in that category, you can put, classically psychological operation and everything that goes along with that. Incidentally, of course, even if one was just to see the whole phenomena through that lens, and I think it's not a fair treatment of the experiences and mass of, anecdotes and research that people have done into this domain. But nevertheless, it's part of the set that is, relevant for the discourse. And I think even if you were to take the view that the weirdest of the weird is the realest of the real, psychological operations are still happening and are still relevant to reckon with as part of the total epistemic context. And even with that, relatively mundane perspective, the tremendous power and capacity to manipulate perception that's accordant with such things as psyops, but then also the danger of our own voluntary or involuntary, through manipulation, creation of categories and narratives of interpretation, which themselves then come to function as kind of feedback cybernetic attractors, to which then people adapt their understandings or then lose themselves in wars of sense making, becomes tremendously relevant when it comes to how we open up to the total field of understanding about consciousness, power, and all the rest of it, right? And so that's just one category. We're doing it to each other. And then there's maybe we're doing it to ourselves, but altogether less consciously, which might speak to the broad category of a kind of perspective that someone like Jung began to take with respect to the collective, spontaneous, apparition, manifestation, projection of the UFO image, in times of strife in the world. And of course, we are in a fragmented world in times of strife at the moment, which I think is tremendously relevant when we come to think about as well why interest in UAP and disclosure is gaining such traction for many of the same reasons that Jung pointed towards. Images above that speak to the possibility of some big other that might stand for some wholeness, harmony, unveiling of a new logic or order of belonging that might serve as some fabric for reweaving religion or something like this, as yet another manifestation of the psyche of the self, or as that which stands as that image of wholeness. And I'm not advocating taking that perspective, but it's one type of perspective one could take to articulate how we, more or less unconsciously, as a collective unconscious activity, are summoning, manifesting a relation of, a primarily imaginal set of contents into the life world, into the zeitgeist, and all the different feedback dynamics with that. And there's many, many things to say in relation there. And then you've got, well, both of those first two things can be true. We can be doing it to each other, doing it unconsciously to ourselves. And then what about the so-called external other, the alien as such, or maybe the external in the context of our interior, right? If one wanted to take that metaphysical perspective, well, they're external in the sense of they're beyond, they're an intelligent contact with intelligence beyond ourselves, but which, couldn't be reduced on standard, whatever we mean by standard, scientific theories of reality. Can't just be reduced to some physical external phenomena that's flown in from somewhere else, but is in fact belongs in some extra dimensional or other than ordinary dimensional way in some context of communication, which can nevertheless be influential and agentic in some way, right? And there's obviously so much to explore in there. What do we mean by interior, exterior? And so just to begin to even reckon with the various presuppositions and categories and worldviews that people can take in relation to all of this requires being metaphysically flexible in certain ways. But I think, in seeking in something that looks like a kind of integration that can more or less hold a conversation together enough to say in some process of genuine exchange, then I do think we can begin to trace what kind of metaphysics, what kind of philosophy of communication is in fact helpful for both the epistemics of engaging with the phenomena, and in that very process as well, opening up to at least ontological possibility. But I think in many respects, uncovering an opening and a question where the question itself, in a sense, corresponds to ontology, that the question is part of the ontology. So I'll stop there because there's loads of different elements in that and different ways we might like to go. But there's many reasons I'm very curious. So obviously I'm interested in wherever you'd like to take this, but please as well, just at a personal level, I'm very curious about your experiences at the largest UFO conference in the world, as far as I understand it, called Contact in the Desert. And in some of the podcasts I've listened to, people recounting experiences they've had do seem to, at such conferences as these, you have people who are particularly disposed to contact. And so some interesting things. I imagine it's kind of like, a festival after it's gotten going. It's kind of like a context for maximizing synchronicity. So I'm kind of curious just what the general energy was like in the space. And you spoke about both how you are noticing the discourse about the encounters themselves advancing. So in that regard, I'm curious what you find to be plausible or interesting at the level of explanation as far as it goes. And there was another thing too, but maybe that's enough. I'm curious what you're seeing has really come through in this context, and obviously take it any way you like.
Okay. Well, it's funny because I think it might have been, again, like audience agnostic conversation. You're getting people like Dave Snowden on this show. It might have made more sense to start with the cultural anthropology of the conference than to be like, I've experienced ghosts and UFOs.
I'll do some magic with the edit.
I have to just sit with that. But I like it does matter. Like, you can say all you want about, Bashar and, the millions of subscribers to this world, this reality tunnel in the Robert Anton Wilson sense of it. But I do think that, part of, I am a zeitgeist tracker. And it's interesting to note that, you've got, American Vice President J.D. Vance weighing in on this. I think they're angels and demons. That's like, it is in that sense no longer an unspeakable issue. But as Diana Reed Slattery talked about in her book Xenolinguistics, which is very pertinent to this conversation, there are multiple different kinds of unspeakable. There's the unspeakable that is just the like social taboo. There's the unspeakable that is like literally you cannot describe. You have no words for it. There's the unspeakable where the taboo is leaky. It is something that can be discussed, but like if your job, if your job is not like my buddy Michael Phillip to host a podcast about this stuff, then, you may have an enormous amount of interest in this and still be putting your collaborators at risk reputationally to bring it up. And I think, in the years that I spent working in science communication in, in complex systems land, working somewhere that is renowned for being an international hub of blue sky thinking, a place that started in making the decision not to remain beholden to doing physics for national defense concerns. There is nonetheless still a socioeconomic pressure to appear reputable in order to appeal to donors and to the National Sciences Foundation, to the source of the money. And I think, like, in that sense, what I am tracking in the zeitgeist is that the economy as a collective intelligence, as a kind of life-like entity in its own regard, is also going through a kind of ontological shock right now. And I'll try to make this connection here. When you talk about being metaphysically flexible, when you mention that Jung noted that the UFO as an archetype appears in times of strife, that it reminds me of something I learned while I was working at the Santa Fe Institute from researcher Michel Gervon gave a talk on noise injection in machine learning, and how if you're trying to do weather prediction, that simply running a a machine learning algorithm on weather data will only give you a particular predictive horizon. You can only get like 3 days out, at least at the time. This was a few years ago. There were mathematical limits to how well even extremely granular meteorological data would allow you to forecast things. But if you added like a camera trained on a bucket of water, and you just kick the water and you create waveforms in it, and then you feed the camera data into the model, then you're able to double the predictive horizon because it's no longer overfitting on its training data. And, so I've worked in complex system science communication, and, I've worked in various AI research adjacent positions. And this question of the noise and the role of noise, which in a philosophical sense, and I've written about this and I'll send you the links you can share in the show notes, the sense of like whether or not there is such a thing as true randomness, like whether indeterminacy or the apparently non-deterministic behaviors of physical systems are simply because, as Reinhard Pagel argues in Information is Energy, that information is conserved, but it is dispersed and it's not retrievable. That's what entropy is. It's the loss of retrievability. Or if you're somebody like, and the book's too far, it's over there, but my buddy Eric Wargo, who I've had on my show several times, who believes that noise is future information, that it's retrocausal information, and that his whole framework for understanding precognitive experience is that we tend to our brains are capable of remembering their own future states, but we tend to discard those experiences because they do not make sense according to our own models, according to the models that we've generated over our lives, or they are like wrapped in a precognitive dream is wrapped in the symbolism of the experiences you've already had. This also connects to conversations that I've had with Andrew Gallimore, who works on DMT neuroscience and has made, I think, a very compelling case that these seemingly agentic other beings that consistently show up to people under the influence of tryptamines are not merely dreams or archetypes, because you can see what looks like a kind of ingress of novel information into the brain, and the brain like attempting to. But at any rate, I'm kind of straying here from the point, which is that I think the economy and the human brain, that that this is a sort of as above so below system where and again, nod to Snowden, right? Like when the model fails, when we're not having that kind of like expert on expert podcast here in a clear, simple domain, or a complicated but nonetheless like expert appropriate domain, then living systems ramp up a kind of a metabolic response. And that, in the conversations I was having with Andrew and earlier conversations I've had with, Eric Davis, the author of High Weirdness, not Eric Davis, the UFO guy, but it's funny that there are two of them. But Eric had this idea in his the PhD thesis he later published at MIT Press, that there is this metabolic ontology. And I think that this is related to what my friend and mentor Richard Doyle has talked about in his book Darwin's Pharmacy, about the what he calls the ecodelic being a surge, like inducing a surge of information that absolutely does not comport with the models that you have of reality. And basically the difference between a good trip and a bad trip is whether you are able to deploy a response to that where you're able to stabilize at a higher logical order or not. And so like Gallimore talks about this in terms of representational reach, that the brain is actually quite capable of modeling more than 3 spatial dimensions, and it just doesn't because it's expensive. And that there are certain cases where you don't really have a choice. The brain's response to this information surge is a temporary ramp in modeling capacity. And, maybe we are going through something like that as an economy right now where, over a much longer arc, because we're talking about a system of much greater spatiotemporal scale than an individual human brain, that the emergence of modern digital information technologies, first the internet and now also AI, is something like a psychedelic that the entire human civilization is taking at once, and that we're seeing it in the economy. The symptom of this would be that we now need much greater diversity of inputs. And, I've been thinking about this. I'm getting on kind of more of a normal rant here that's like more kind of AI adjacent. But, the industrial economy was very low dimensional. It was only capable of measuring so much and communicating so much within itself. And so you had, relatively few job categories. It wasn't capable of integrating information over very long timescales. And so it wasn't able to understand the economic value of cultural creation or the arts or, like spiritual practice. And this is something I got into philosophy, something I got into when I was talking with Matthew David Segal on my show about how, like, I think we've been kind of brainwashed into thinking that philosophy has no economic value, that it is purely intrinsic. But there is what psychologist Alison Gopnik calls the explore-exploit tension in human developmental psychology, where like children are much more interested in novelty than adults because their brains are operating at a much higher temperature in terms of their accommodation of noise. It's more effective for learning. Let me just kind of sum that up by saying that I think that there is an important relationship between us going through a crisis in meaning making and an economic crisis and an information scaling crisis and a profusion of individual encounters with weirdness and an opening in public discourse for these things. And that, again, like my inclination is to see our encounter with what appears to be non-human intelligence in the form of what, UAPs or like, we didn't say unidentified submerged objects, but those are an enormous piece of this,
right?
This disclosure data, that it's also coming at the same time that we're going through a decades-long revolution in a fundamental theory of intelligence, when like suddenly we are starting to decode animal communication, and we're thinking about how, like, we're starting to be able to model the, if there are, for instance, this book is from 2008, but Andrew P. Smith's The Dimensions of Experience, I highly recommend, where, he's talking about the interiority of, plants, and how, like, the evolutionary constraints on a plant would, according to, this, he's like a neuroscientist. And so he's, Stanford trained, and thinking about the coevolution of biological form dating all the way back to like molecular biology, enzymes, and so on, and how there's an interior, the same kind of interior dimensionality of representation through the interactions between holons at different levels. So the fact of it all happening at once comes as no surprise to me, nor do I think it offers us an easy out, right? Like, we can't just say, oh, you're just struggling to make sense of things and therefore projecting this. Because, like, when you say, for instance, we're doing it to ourselves, there are so many ways in which that could be true, and they could all be true at the same time. And like, we, it's like we kind of gloss over this question of, what do we mean when we say ourselves? Certainly, in a kind of Jungian transpersonal sense, it doesn't necessarily mean like the guy that you normally think you are when you're going to work in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is again where the work of people like Gallimore, Donald Hoffman, who's, doing work to very much in line with this, thinking about how, what there are evolutionary constraints on our ability to model the richness of reality. And this idea that, the self is something that we must now include in this category of alien as being far weirder and hyperdimensional than we thought. So, okay, so that's
can I jump in here?
That's a rant.
Great. Okay, so there's something. So
we'll do the concept report. We'll do the conference report.
We will. I would definitely want to get to that. Part of my question with respect to that is, and was what kind of is advancing, on your view, and I believe you said as much, forwards motion in the space in terms of theoretical understanding. You also mentioned disclosure. So I am curious about how you perceive how various figures in the space are really perceiving the real of disclosure and what that means, and there's just something human and political about that, which is, I'm just curious in a sense for your human to human sense of it. So, but you did articulate quite a lot there that can be food for thinking with respect to forwards movement in theoretical understanding. But I don't want to lose one particular thread which has kept coming up for me. And I'll see if I can language it. One of the ways you've pointed towards it is with this notion of potential higher orders of logic. And you also somewhat reference it there in referencing Donald Hoffman speaking about evolutionary constraints on the human's capacity to know the world. Now, there's obviously, he's including evolution in there. I do read something, really quite Kantian in Donald Hoffman's work. And, so it's worth presencing that we are, in a sense, somewhat bound to the perceptions of phenomenality that have come about through the evolutionary conditionings on what is structuring our experience, and that the noumenon, right, in the Kantian is beyond that. Now, that's not how I've found myself, at least, thinking or relating with the world, as far as I can tell, philosophically, for a very long time now. And the one way to communicate that with respect to the context of our conversation is to bring to focus communication. And there's partly in this a question when we address the phenomena of UAP or USP, the submerged phenomena, right, which is certainly relevant, but is to what degree, and in the same way when you begin speaking about some of your earlier experiences with psi phenomena and hauntings and different things, and in mentioning psychedelics, these various ways we can be opened up, and that the brain then, as you've articulated, invests more in seeking out how to model better, or at least create some kind of way of stabilizing perception. And the question in some sense is, to what degree is there a there to break through to, versus to what degree are we bound to fall back onto, or simply just find another adjacent stabilizing perch in some way where you might be metaphysically pluralist, but ultimately you're still sort of scrabbling around at a similar resolution of lack or something like this. And so there's a question here with respect to the role that UAP and different kinds of opening experiences, strange experiences, can play in our epistemic pluralism, or rigor of process in seeking out how to approach a phenomena in different ways without becoming myopic and stuck. Recognizing we might just wake up into yet another trance of stuckness with respect to our interpretation, believing that we've found actually the thing, and then whole careers and identities and group spirits might come, religions may come to be built around some of these things, right? And so what is important for me is, well, what is the context of our communication and modes of relating in communication with respect to the transition and movement between frames? But I do believe that has to be accompanied by an approach to ontology that recognizes the ontology bound up with the epistemics in some critical sense, again, with respect to the primacy of communication and the role it's playing here. It does seem to me like humility points toward there being layers of there in the question of the many truths and the absolute truth of reality. I see it as, in an important way, a process of creativity and dreaming in some important way. And so, what may be true of the nature of cosmos in eons to come is itself in some relevant way subject to a kind of change. Maybe people might say a kind of emergence. But I do tend to see that how cosmos, how intelligence, how creativity, what do we mean by all of these things, but participates in that creativity, in that change, is for me an axis of grounding, is an axis of stabilization. Now that, we can explore throughout other conversations, through other topics as well. So, but what I'm wanting to sort of presence is, again, this thread of opening up to epistemic possibility, but then this question of opening up to depths or different perspectives on ontology, which can obviously be world-changing. Now, this comes across in UAP discourse as, well, new physics, new technology, craft that enables new power to do this and that, right? So obviously that's a kind of mundane, although relevant perspective. I mean, the materiality of all of this is central to the whole UAP phenomena. But the other piece to weave into this that I think is a nice way into perceiving the different orders of logic, or orders of perception, orders of logic, orders of phenomenology, which point towards a richer ontology of being, comes through when you bring up the potential or the nature of the interiority of plants, and of course, interspecies communication and this sort of thing. I always, it's a wonderful thing to watch time-lapse videos of plants, trees, forests. There's something in me that's, skeptical of reducing a certain kind of agency to the sensory motor loop that functions at the level of mammals or creatures that, act as predator and prey at time horizons that seem relevant to us. But there's something about the responsiveness of organism over time that is on a different rhythm and order. And we had a conversation that was a little like this with Jeremy Johnson on the podcast maybe a year and a half ago now. But there's this question of responsivity and communication over scopes of time, which, I think are indicative of, well, what is mediating that communication, and what characterizes the interiority or the imaginality, the images, the sense of telos, the orientation toward becoming, the quality, right, the meaningfulness of it, what participates in that across different time horizons, I think is super fascinating. And I'll use that as a little bit of a playful jump to just play with the idea that contact as such with the alien, right, in quotation marks, in terms of a progressive communication of image and sense of meaning with respect to the cosmos, whether through geometry, right, whether with respect to ethics even, and the recognition of the symbiosis and the integrity of life, what kind of images and meanings have we come to awareness of, mediated in part through the dream, and what kind of intelligence is operative in furnishing the symbology of the dreaming, and so influencing our sense of the ontology of the world, providing in a sense an epistemic toolkit, if you like, to connect meanings together, but in that very process coming to a sense of how reality connects and fits together, and what kinds of combinations and connections and formations of ecology, of human society, of intelligent effort can come about through that connectivity, so that we can glean into and explore, the depths and further dimensions of reality. There's this sense of how the epistemology and our approach to it, how we participate in that, what influences us in the participation in how we make sense of the world, is in a way wrapped up with our very, well, obviously, epistemology is connected to ontology. But anyway, I could attempt to recapitulate there, but there's something about like the really there of the ontology, and then just the metabolic process of stabilization for the sake of adaptivity, and the question of these weaving together seems to be part of, well, it feels almost too trite to say how we participate in creativity itself, or reality is made or co-constructed in some sense. I don't know. I see what you want to do with that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will try and weave some of the stuff that I picked up at the conference into this, because we owe that to your listeners. First of all, but however, I want to cite William Irwin Thompson in a chapter of his book Coming into Being, where he's talking about Zecharia Sitchin and what he called the misplaced concreteness of Sitchin's narrative around ancient alien intervention in human evolution. Thompson says, there is a hermeneutics to the imagination, and its images can never be taken literally. The imagination is the intermediate realm between matter and spirit. It is the realm of psyche. The economy is also an intermediate realm between matter and spirit. On the one hand, there is nature, say the veins of gold in the earth, and on the other, compassion. A paper dollar is not a literal hunk of value. It is a consensual instrument that allows a cultural domain to come into play. So it is with an image from the realm of the psyche. The image one creates of an angel or an extraterrestrial is not a literal hunk of life. It is a negotiable instrument that allows domains that are multidimensionally transcendent to the human evolutionary body with its sensorium to enter into relationship, to allow a new culture to come into play. What we cannot see, we can imagine. What one imagines is what is in one's storehouse of imagery. So some sensitives see angels as insipid girlish boys with giant pigeon wings. Others cannot conceive of angels, and so they imagine extraterrestrials appearing at the foot of the bed as they go to sleep and abducting them into flying saucers. And I think that, he's getting at the same thing ultimately that Gallimore is getting at, which is that, or that Wargo is getting at, which is, your learning algorithm, the models that you generate, the imaginal interface to, at least in the way that Thompson talks about it and the way that you just talked about it, a world that, Thompson says very specifically that, consciousness is a kind of latency coordination space, or not consciousness in the sort of spiritual sense, but your conscious phenomenal experience is coordinating inputs at all of these different scales that are arriving into this nexus of coordination at different times. And this is where it almost gets into Jeremy Narby terrain, the cosmic serpent, where he's talking about Amazonian ayahuasca shamans having these visualizations of DNA and human microbiology, that this is the level where this is where we encounter things that are happening faster or slower than our body can actually perceive them. And I think that that's a really grounded way to think about what's going on. But then I want to also say that just as a vibe check of this conference, I was interested in how thoroughly entwined the conversations around the UFO and disclosure were with the conversations around psi phenomena, precognition, and that, Danny Sheehan in particular, who gave a kind of an introductory keynote at the conference. Danny is the head of, a major disclosure organization, the New Paradigm Institute. He was a an attorney on retainer for John Mack, the Harvard psychologist who almost lost his tenure for investigating the UFO phenomenon. He's been a deep part of this discourse for decades now. And make of this what you will, but he got up on stage and said with what I experienced as some, like a fair amount of authority, that the reason that we are having this experience now, the reason that we are being visited, is that our species is actually, this is specifically what he said. He's like, the strain of government disclosure discourse is akin to the Sufi saying that when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are their pockets. That when the military and the intelligence community are encountering these phenomena and they focus on propulsion technology, then they ignore other key pieces of it, namely the apparent ability of these entities to bilocate or to teleport, abilities that are consonant with, stories of human avatars in religious literature. And that, like, why we are going through this now is that, as he put it, the next stage of human evolution is characterized by the development of a new faculty akin to vision or hearing for direct perception of that which bonds everything into a unified harmonic whole and allows us to discern what conduct aligns with natural order.
Can I just say that exact move there, the potential extrasensory that then enables a sense for higher order, is partly what I was trying to reflect back in terms of the epistemology and the ontology and the potential connectedness. Just as for anybody who was attempting to track the thread of what I was expressing there, not to interrupt, but please.
Yeah. I'll say that, and this comes up a lot. This came up in my own experiences in 2011. I talked about them on Danny Jones, this sort of praying mantises I saw on ayahuasca in Peru. This came up in Andrew P. Smith, The Dimensions of Experience, where he says, so you have Edwin Abbott's Flatland, this famous book that has really helped to shape the conversation around the idea that there are possibly additional dimensions beyond our capacity to perceive. But in Flatland, the Flatlanders actually live in only two dimensions. They do not inhabit the third. And what Smith says, what the mantises said, what, the general consensus of everyone at Contact in the Desert, and put in very concrete terms on the last day by, my friend Michael Phillip when he gave his talk. He said, there's not one of these realms that we're not in. We're in all of them. And I don't see it as Kantian thing in itself so much as I see it as, Smith and several others at the conference were basically actually, I think I may have it bookmarked here. He says, higher dimensional experience may be more useful in evolutionary terms, more adaptive, and might also be considered more real. I believe a very strong case can be made for the notion that evolutionarily higher organisms, although, some may take issue with his use of the, higher, experience the world more realistically than lower organisms. But life begins as dimensionless experience, and it may end that way as well. Sheehan was, basically suggesting that something that I think is very convergent with what Smith is getting at in this book, which is that there are these points of inflection, for instance, when cells come together into a complex multicellular life form, where the new level of identity of that entity is for a while zero dimensional. Like it has there's no competition, like if the extremely early multicellular ecosystems were not like the nature red in tooth and claw of the late Cambrian. They were organisms that had in some sense like ascended beyond competition, and therefore did not require the complex navigational and social reality that beings like us have. But at the same time, he makes the point that, and this is where we get into this thing about the, all the way back to this question where I started with this, which was a question of the directionality of evolution, which is, if there is a pressure to evolve for certain organisms under certain conditions into higher dimensional representation, then it is sort of ecologically or socially induced. He says, for instance, and this kind of recombinant thing really matters here. And I'll get back from this to the piece on communication and interface. He says, though individual holons in a society express complexity through their multiple interactions with other holons, generally no individual holon can exist in as many different states as the entire society can. In a two-component system, the total number of possible states of the system is just 2, the same as the possible number of states of each component. But a 3-component system may exist in 8 different states. A 4-component system may exist in 64. A 5-component system may exist in 1024. So while the complexity of individual holons may increase substantially as the society of which they are members increases in size, doubling with each new component added in our example, the complexity of the entire society may increase by a far greater degree. Its rate of increase doubles from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. In other words, the complexity of the entire system increases more than exponentially as a function of the complexity of its individual components. So like there is always a sense in which we are inadequate to the complexity of our environment and like incapable of encoding it in its completeness. And like this is where like the piece on human language comes in, where like the emergence of syntax was a response to this new low dimensional entity, which is like the human community, like a human society or proto-human society, which has to sense make within itself in a situation where the number of evolutionarily relevant communication events scales more than exponentially with respect to linear population increase. Like and above a certain population size, we just need to speak in sentences. And I think that that's something like that is going on right now. And that there is, there was a panel there on the relationship between AI and NHI, and a British
NHI,
non-human intelligence,
right?
Which is another one of these, euphemisms for aliens. This guy Deep Prasad, who's a quantum computing researcher in Vancouver, said that a lot of people point to the sudden spike in UFO activity after the first nuclear tests and say, well, this, a lot of experiencers say they seem very preoccupied with us not blowing up the biosphere. They warn us about thermonuclear warheads. You've got Robert Hastings, who, wrote his book on UAPs visiting nuclear facilities and so on. But, Prasad says the bomb was also quantum mechanics. It was, it meant in order to have the bomb, it meant we needed lasers, fiber optics, and transistors, which are all things we need in order to develop artificial intelligence, which is a substrate for this higher dimensional. You think about like direct brain-to-brain communication as the next step past, speaking to one another in, mouth noises, and how like the complexity of the like planet scale economy and the emergence of the planet as a, like people talk about the like Teilhard de Chardin, the noosphere as the future of this, following on Vernadsky, that, maybe it is the UFO. And again, like this is very akin to stuff that Jung was talking about, that Terence McKenna was talking about, that the UFO is actually in the imaginary of the planetary intelligence that is emerging right now through the relationship between human and non-human and machine intelligence. And, and so that like, maybe the reason that this is and will remain ontologically challenging to us is because we are still sort of stuck behind the curve in terms of, the number of representational states that we can collectively take place, like can explore as a biosphere, technosphere entity. And that, what the aliens are really interested in is just making sure that the this like Gaian level intelligence that they can actually have a conversation with doesn't die in the cradle,
right.
So, but they do, according to like Whitley Strieber was there. And for, people who don't know Strieber, his presence was also very notable to me. Like, he's a lifelong experiencer. His entire family has been, visited. He told a story of his 7-year-old son being abducted, and his son the next day, like, told him about being taken up into space to see the Earth from space. And, Strieber definitely acknowledges this sort of a thread of like, they want us to be aware of ourselves as part of this planetary entity, but also they are his experience of them as attested is that they are very concerned with our individual evolution as well. And I think that, that like this is one of those sort of, is it one or the other things that just sort of falls apart in under closer examination, because if you are not two with the planet, how could you only be concerned with, psychological individuation of Tim Adalin or, the healthy birth of the guy in Overmind? Like that it does not compute.
Yeah.
I really went out there on that one, but we still haven't really talked about the conference.
I know. I did bloody ask you.
I will say one more thing about that, though, which I think is really important here. Following on Danny Sheehan's comments, and also Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée, I was blessed to be, present for what he said was his final conference appearance. The way that he put it, he said, hold on as I flip through pages. What is going to happen with disclosure is that they're going to disclose what everyone already knows, that they exist. The problem is that the Pentagon has to rely on science, and the science just isn't well developed enough. And, he said, we don't need another 100,000 cases of lights in the sky. What we are getting today on TV is a joke. The question of, is it preparing us for something more serious? I hope. And he referenced the fact that, that a lot of these accounts are of beings that look and walk like us, that breathe our air, that make legible facial expressions. Instead, he said, we are headed in the other direction. More and more secret programs are getting founded with different levels of security clearance. More and more projects that are classified. That's not disclosure. And I think that this is interesting. Like, to go back to this, again, my frame on this, as a student of major evolutionary transitions, is that when there is a new emergent meta individual, it creates all of these new niches. Like, you think about the evolution of the complex multicellular life form, suddenly provides novel environments for bacteria of all different kinds. Like, you can have bacteria, you can have parasites that specialize in the heart tissue or the liver tissue or the brain tissue. And it is an overall increase in the surface area. Again, the dimensionality, the opportunity space for life. And what that has meant in practice is, that oxygen exhaling photosynthetic organisms that created this economic opportunity for the oxygen breathing glycolytic animal metabolism ended up forcing an enormous amount of the life that existed. Up to that point, everything was anaerobic, and it all went underground. And now we have a surprisingly rich, deep geological microbiome on this planet that extends kilometers below the surface of the planet. It's like all of these organisms that were forced underground or forced into the gastrointestinal tract of complex life forms by oxygen. And so, I think that, as frustrated as Vallée might be, I actually think that the proliferation of these classified programs is a sign of progress in disclosure discourse. I think that it's akin to this bifurcation of aerobic and anaerobic life forms. That it's that what we're seeing is an enhanced diversity in the possible approaches to disclosure or to the study of this stuff. It's like what we were talking about earlier. It's like suddenly there's all of these new ways to come at this. And one of the most hopeful ways that I saw, again, as just like a read on where the culture is that effectively nobody at Contact in the Desert had any hope whatsoever that government-led disclosure would be anything other than a psyop or an attempt to seize narrative control or to, induce sort of premature ontological closure around this. Like Diana Paschulka, who unfortunately was not there, but, Paschulka, as a religious scholar, has talked about this as kind of resonant with the formation of the Catholic Church and, the reduction of all of the Gospels by the Septuagint into the Catholic canon. That what we're looking at now is, again, this, the institutional intelligence as a living system trying to metabolize all of this with the simplest possible model it can, which it believes is a model about nuts and bolts craft and military secrets and national security. Meanwhile, the vast consensus in the experiencers at Contact in the Desert was that this is not an institutional problem anymore, that real contact will be led in a grassroots way, that it will be through coalitions of experiencers who will probably be actively oppressed in a similar way to like Gnostic Christians, in the early church. Like, you can't talk like this. It doesn't support the story. And are now forming blocks of mutual aid and support in preparation for, the advancement of both evidence for extraterrestrial or extra dimensional life, and the advancement of government and corporate attempts to maintain their power as they, as an increasingly crazy world just like shears them of any measure of real control over what is going on. And so, like, I think that the most interesting thing about the conference was how many people there were involved in either, again, like grassroots political organization, or were like, there was one guy in particular I keep meaning to talk to. He had a site called Discover. I have no relationship to him as of the time of this recording, but I just thought that this was a really cool project. Discoverparadox.com, DOCS. So he's
I
collecting.
saw something.
Yeah, what he's doing is he's collecting a database of just like an enormous number of firsthand reports, and then running it through AI and identifying patterns in it. And like, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about like the institutions are not prepared to ask the most interesting questions right now, but the accessibility of these new technologies that allow us to draw knowledge graphs and then form metagraphs on those knowledge graphs and create a kind of exegetical layer on top of, to gather and then annotate and append and perform hermeneutics on and data analysis on all of this stuff. Like Beatrice Villarroel was there, the astrophysicist who's, thanks to, modern computing, was able to identify thousands of transient luminous objects in these old, observatory plates that predate, the officially launched human satellites. And strangely enough, they seem to be correlated with changes in geomagnetic activity, which, I think is interesting because you've got researchers, like I've been fascinated for almost 20 years with this Australian researcher, Darren Lipnicki, who also found a correlation between an inverse correlation between how unusual his dreams were and how intense geomagnetic activity was over Perth, which leads us back to like Gallimore and John Mack, connecting UFO abductee literature with the DMT experience. Like there's something going on inside of us and outside of us at the same time. And it's starting to show up in instrument readings that are being, analyzed by citizen scientists and are being, they're like coalitions of people are mobilizing on this stuff. And I don't know how, the government is going to handle that,
Right.
Like, it's like, obviously you want it to congeal into a new religion. You want people like JDV, like the idea that this is like, these are demons who happen to have like really great toys that we need to fight China and Russia. That's the new religion,
Yeah.
like, come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think that the very last thing I'll say about it is that at some point I need to have a conversation with Michael Phillip about this, because the one thing that it seemed like a lot of people, even some of the more kind of prestigious scientific people there, were like chewing on and not making sense of, was how it seems like it is both an immaterial phenomenon and a material phenomenon, that both the nuts and bolts explanation and the like celestial transdimensional entity explanation are true. And the people that I felt like had the most coherence about this, one of them again was Danny Sheehan. It was like, and also Michael Phillip, because he talked about Proclus and Iamblichus, ancient esoteric Greek philosophy, and this like the, I don't know, like this chain of being, and how like, you look at something like the Vedas talk about mind as a form of matter. So I think like when we're talking about this higher logical order thing, and we're talking about non-dual, like direct perception of a non-dual reality, and we're talking about being able to technologize states of consciousness, in order to do like crazy things with like craft that are in some sense an extension of the nervous system of their operators. It's like, why are we getting hung up on this distinction between spirit and matter? Why are we getting hung up on this distinction between, the mind and the body? And I think that's, if anything, like that's probably the most hopeful thing about this, is that, the UFO is just one more ecodelic phenomenon showing up at a very ecodelic time to remind us that the self-other constructs of the modern era are just inadequate now.
Right.
End rant.
Yeah, some really awesome expression in there. So I think you've touched on a lot of what is at stake and why this topic matters. One basic way that I would offer to frame, not all of it, but a good portion of why I think it's worthwhile to engage this topic publicly, in dialogue, relationally, all the rest of it, is because on the one hand, there is this tendency to give over agency to the big other of the state, of the deep state, which may come to articulate itself at a more exoteric level in the, the J.D. Vance religion of demons and spaceships. But then on the other side of it, and arguably that Vance example is an example of this too, without philosophical rigor and scientific rigor and real deep address, then there's every indication that the big other of however it is, in some reductive, low resolution way, the alien will be interpreted by this group or that group. Everything Bashar has to say, everything this person has to say, and whatever becomes canon in this group of people that might even be persecuted for their views. There's all these dynamics of the all too human participation in knowledge or challenges to knowledge, which become ontological shocks with political ramifications down the line of that, down the line of those cultural perturbations and bindings to identity. Now, that doesn't speak to all of it at the level of what's philosophically interesting. And I think you point towards how a sort of naive metaphysics of mind stuck in a forever separate sense of spirit and matter, totally different interpretations of phenomena which struggle for some reconciliation, and that there are richer, more interesting approaches to the philosophy as such, which I think are wrapped up in actually what it is to engage in, well, naturally understanding the phenomena and orienting with respect to what's worth creating and what's worth binding to. There's something about that example of flatland which is definitely very relevant. And then I also just recognize all the different philosophical examples from Plato's cave, brains in a vat, popular stories of the Matrix, and all the rest of it, as we approach a world in which AI models will be rapidly able to spin up your own personal World of Warcraft. And within that dimension, one will make their meaning and spend so much of their time. Now, of course, like what's behind that at a level of power and capital and all the rest of it is very much relevant to the broader understanding. But the notion that through technology, as well as through the technology of memetics, we can create, whether egregores, belief structures, religions, what's sourcing those religions. I'm not trying to be reductive about that. But we can very much source for ourselves whole worlds, whole dimensions within which we will dwell. And it does offer an interesting angle on this question of what ontologies comprise reality. And, of course, part of the UAP phenomena also has one of those threads of interpretation which argues that there has been alien contact and meddling in our DNA at some point. Earlier on, that would be the more nuts and bolts perhaps interpretation, and then earlier on I was attempting to elucidate some more imaginal way of influencing the symbology and structures of perception so as to be able to connect more deeply with other patterns in reality. And you gave some examples of that through various authors. And so in and among all of that, there remains something so critical about how we rigorously specify what our claims to the really real are. And at the same time, we continue to wrestle with the whole structure of social, political, identity, archetypal layers of interpretation, which continue to color our epistemologies around what we can notice, but then also what we feel empowered to speak or open up to receive in each other. And so all of that, like so many of these other topics, are just so critical to not abstain from engaging, right, as creatures in communication. And so not giving over to the big other of either the nuts and bolts power or the big other of the more ephemeral, spurious interpretations which unconsciously govern our sense of where we sit in the order of things. That seems to me super crucial. And yet it can often be the case. A friend of mine, Campbell, say this: I'm not so interested in UAP phenomena because you can't really do anything with it, you know? Now, he's super interested in it, really, I believe. And he's very, very interested in all the adjacent topics and the metaphysics of interpretation and so much of this conversation. And I'll often come back to the danger of impotence making of so many high attention, salient contexts. And it's the case that a number of the podcasts, you mentioned earlier on, a sort of guilty pleasure of listening to certain things and paying attention. And I can relate to that. But I'm also, from an anthropological perspective, it's super interesting to hear where the zeitgeist is. And so maybe you and I could argue that part of a sort of role in the world is to stay abreast of the zeitgeist in some ways that we could, justify. But then who isn't, in their own way, attempting to stay abreast of what the zeitgeist is, of whatever you have to at some point. I mean, it's paying attention to you at some level, or at least it's influencing you. And so how to engage this topic without becoming mired in impotence is one of the critiques I obviously do take very seriously when people are wanting to engage in understanding at a theological, political level, theopolitical level of what can really source our binding and participation together now in a healthy way, so that we can withstand and respond to the evolutions of our time at the technological, cultural level. All of that, we should be caring about poverty and geopolitics and all of that and all the other things, right? Regulation, and how is this stuff relevant? It's like, well, there are naturally way too many things in the world to be named. And so I'm by no means arguing that everything is relevant to everyone. And yet, for some of the reasons I've given, this is a context that is interpenetrating and is adjacent and is just connected to a number of liminal and influential contexts in our time that influence people's attention, influence our sense of who we are, where we belong in the order of things, and the sense of time and energy people have to even invest in the endeavor of belonging together. And so can't just abdicate it. And there's nuts and bolts that may be relevant. Do you know what I mean? And that's the other thing about it. I agree with the basic criticism, in a sense of getting stuck at a metaphysics of relating to things. And at the same time, like with everything, this is a topic that's mired in a history of, at least if you take it at the psychological operation level, which itself obviously is naturally part of a military, industrial, game theoretic, imperial, is this whole machinations of big blocks of power violently going at it over centuries. And at the individual level, any kind of means will justify the ends they're seeking of dominance. And so MK Ultra, through the various sort of, what do they call it? Not the mind sight, the far sight, the remote viewing, where remote viewing experiments come in touch with, CIA operations and all the things which fill out the late night algorithm with interesting stories. There are, at the very least, nuts and bolts contexts, which the evidence seems very plausible, are highly interested in just what kind of access to communication, to exchange across distances, remote viewing. There's a massive open question as to what substrates mediate communication in being, between entities, between beings and ecology. What substrates constitute that ecodelic fabric which we are of and constitutes us? And that is, I like that as a framing for what is like a binding context of address that brings these worlds of nuts and bolts and the celestial together a little bit. So I'll definitely be taking that away as a term. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I will just say that, again, I want to go back to some of Whitley Strieber's comments here, because I think, I really came away from this event with a much deeper appreciation for the nuance of his thinking in this. He believes that the family is the interface for contact. And this is true in my experience. And my friend Stuart Davis hosted a show called Aliens and Artists, where he ran 100 interviews with experiencers. I highly recommend digging into that as like disintermediate the disclosure event. Strieber said, there tends to be somebody in the family who doesn't have these experiences. Like they're the control group. And that the family is a sense-making unit that processes the ontological shock together. And I think that system plays out at every level. Like the ideal outcome is not that we collapse into a single interpretive frame. And I think that this rhymes really well with something else that, that Strieber said, which is that they're not our guides. They're not our teachers. They are trying to get you to be your own teacher. They are creating situations that enable learning and discovery, conditions for growth. They are looking for what is new. Like he said, these beings are experiencing as much ontological shock as we are. We are as weird to them as they are to us. They are looking for what is new, and that is why they are not going to tell you what to do. That sometimes there are, like, if they will sometimes give you lessons and suggestions, it's because they want you, he said, they will sometimes give you lessons and suggestions they want you to ignore because they want you to preserve your free will. Always take your side. It's supposed to be up to you, and they will respect your choices. But he also had this thing about, like, the embrace of light and dark. That some of these experiences, like, there will always be a negative side to these experiences. That, they're like light and dark are fundamental to reality. So he said, this is not about pushing it away. It's about balancing the light and dark so it becomes useful, not evil. And that, we ask the light to open the doors of the heart. We ask the dark to open the doors of the mind. And when you do that, the demon becomes a teacher, and it can't hurt you because you own it. The light and dark belong to us. You've got to take charge. So, like, I really do, there's like the Muse song, when the Zetas fill the skies, is just our leaders in disguise. Right. But, it's interesting to hear all of this stuff from someone whose earliest experiences of his encounters with the other were terrifying to him, and how he said, that he was, when he woke up one night and his son was not in bed and a craft was outside, and he was worried that his son had been abducted, and he was filled with fear. He ran out of his cabin to encounter them, and they said to him, "Can we help you get back to bed?" And he's like, "Hell no, I'm freaking out. Like, you've got my kid." But they walked him back inside, and his son was already back in bed. And the next morning, his son told this story about, being taken up to stand with them and look down on Earth from space, and that his son had no fear whatsoever about this. And that, Strieber felt that, that what we're going through right now, it really reminded me of the way that Terence McKenna talked about this, where he said that, he thought that the UFO was, again, a lot of what I've said today is borrowing heavily from his own riffs on this stuff, where, he said, like middle school, you realize that if you're the opposite sex is weird and other, like that it's a developmental thing, and like you're coming of age, and you go through this phase where like girls or boys are gross and scary, and eventually you learn to negotiate the like different but same of it. And that he said that as this progresses, some of the more violent, unpleasant, scary parts of it are worn off. Cultures that meet in war and end in trade, and then they end up having babies together, and it's all like, this is how life works. I'll leave you with two things. One is, without mentioning aliens whatsoever, I wrote a piece recently on becoming planetary that speaks to some of this, that speaks to the refiguration of the self and other in the emergence of planetary culture that was based heavily on the work of William Irwin Thompson. And then the other one is to this point that you're talking about with respect to media and, fifth and I think, sixth generation warfare, which again, like there is Strieber talked about the case of Jake Barber, who was a crash retrieval with the Air Force and approached the, this downed saucer and was suddenly full of love for this like feminine presence he felt on board the craft. He felt like he had received some sort of telepathic thing. And so, Strieber said that because they natively perceive the world as a single entity, and that what makes us different to them is that we have this notion of like sovereignty or individuality, that we experience ourselves as separate. Their weapons, as we might understand them, are not weapons of like the destruction of a physical form. They are emotion projection weapons that change someone hostile into someone loving and gentle. That this is what Jake Barber said of his thing. And to us, this sounds like, Cambridge Analytica. It sounds like, being, that your identity changes. But again, to go back to, Bill Thompson, who said that technology slays the victim and resurrects it with art, and that the modern subject, the autonomous self of industrial modernity, would become the medium of art and the negotiable instrument of economy, that consciousness, states of consciousness, would become the negotiable instrument of the planetary economy. And so I think a lot about that, like the paranoid dimension of this encounter with the weird is structurally identical to the mystical experience of realizing that everything is connected, but somehow still believing that you are separate, and that therefore the entire cosmos must be in conspiracy against you. Whereas like the metanoid perspective is being able to, again, metabolize, to be able to hold the tension between the apparent reality of your informationally bounded, distinct identity with a direct perception of that, the unity of co-arising phenomena. And how we work this out in the philosophy of science and in social epistemology is an issue of intense and persistent attention for me. So if people at this point have somehow managed to hold on to the very end of this conversation without blacking out or tuning out and just like writing me off completely, and are interested in a somewhat more mundane conversation, I really I do not work in this space. I work in the space of how do we develop the socio-technical systems for coherence and sovereign collective intelligence. I work in a distributed, in a federated research commons for, commons-based AI and better teaming technologies. And so I recommend, if what really matters to you, if you've managed to suffer through this, but you are really thinking about how do people get fed? How do we put, how do we know what's real? How do we make sure that the economy still works with artificial superintelligence? The still the dominant thread in news today, and rightly so. Then I recommend the conversation I had earlier this year with Jesse Damiani for his reality studies show, where we talked about how I think all of the stuff that all the evolutionary stuff I've been talking about today informs a plausible vision for the future of the economy and of nested multi-scale collective sense making in hybrid human computer systems. Make of that what you will.
One particular open loop that I'm just also wondering if it's worth seeing if we can close it. You've mentioned being an experiencer. Could you give me a sense, just so, I really am just asking personally, because often these experiences fall into different canonical camps. I'm just curious, if you have you had abduction experiences? Are there crossovers in your psychedelic experiences with UAP encounters? And because that could be a place I could really meet you in sharing some phenomenology. I'm just wondering what the context of your encounters are, just to get a sense of.
sober experiences, psychedelic experiences, dreams, all of those. Although, like, sober is such an asterisk, right? Like, because you're made out of psychoactive neurochemicals. Like, what are we even talking about? I mean, like, nobody is walking around with testing their like DMT levels in their brain at all times. So
what is normal?
Yeah. I think it's like, I think a lot of, again, following Mack and Gallimore, like, I think a lot of these experiences that people are having that are not due to, ayahuasca or DMT or whatever, are due to are nonetheless still correlated. And that's an interesting area for future research once we have the instruments to actually conduct it, with spikes in endogenous tryptamines. And again, like I said, I think that there is a relationship between the prevalence of different neurotransmitters with biogeomagnetic activity. Like there's a biogeomagnetic angle, that there's like planet stuff going on.
Right. So what substrates, what mediums connect, like open up for connection when certain activity is more prominent in us? Like, I think this is absolutely super relevant, right? Yeah, super relevant.
Yeah.
And it's like the frontier of like cell, Michael Levin's work on bioelectricity, like the abstract category of cognitive glue being here, pointing exactly to this. And so for people who are more hard-nosed, and obviously people can have different critiques of this and that, but there are just these genuine questions opening up across contexts of inquiry, scientific inquiry, philosophical inquiry, anthropological evidence of encounter, which, are all suggestive of there being, I don't even know, like more than the mundane interpretations of the normality of what we are. I mean, what is normal anyway?
I just interviewed C.T. Nguyen, the University of Utah philosopher, on the distinction between scoring systems in games, which act as a kind of library of different modes of agency, different way, like you can try on value systems, and scoring systems in metrics, which are used to coordinate human behavior at scale. And the value capture that happens when we are subjected to a kind of permanent environment of an occluded values-based decision in what is worth measuring. So like when you say, like you talk about shaping identity, that conversation goes deep on this issue of like, I don't trust the normative to provide us with an accurate account of reality. Like I said, like normative doesn't even give us the methodological component with which to address a validity claim. All it gives us is intersubjective agreement. Like if you think about like the way that my buddies on Weird Studies podcast talk about this, there's a thin end of the wedge for truth claims, which is the phenomenological. The thick end is the ontological. If we focus on consensus reality, we are not doing adequate investigation of reality. And that is a philosophy of science program, that's a philosophy of science truism that you can find in anybody. Like, like there's a great CBC series on how to think about science from about a decade ago that I highly recommend as content that is not my own, but nonetheless approaches this in a very rigorous way and deeply informs the way that I think about this stuff and why I can't separate the questions of the technological systems that support decentralized credentialing on one hand, like this years-long conversation I've been having with Pooja Olhaver about her political economic writing, from the allocation of attention and funding to, and the sense-making around claims and research questions in spaces like the kind that we've been talking about for the last 2 hours. Like we need a better grammar for this stuff, and we need better systems to support it.
Totally. All right. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask a final time if you can share it just to lead us out with a short story of an experience that just can ground a little bit part of your journey and your interest in this. I won't make any comments. It can be as short as you like, but just for those who have stayed with us until the end as a way of just foregrounding the beginning.
Sure. The second time I saw UFOs as an adult, I had already gone out, I had this experience of seeing them with my girlfriend and my buddy and his girlfriend, and had, in some sense, I think, like kind of failed an intelligence test that night. Again, like, I felt like, we were being invited to make sense of it as a group, and, like afterwards, nobody could agree what they had seen. I had like run off across a field to get a better look at this thing as it was, trundling past us. It was like flying in a sine wave. And I told this story to Eric Davis, like the first time I was ever on a podcast. I was telling him about how it looked like it flew behind a tree, but I could still see it like it was in front of a tree. And I was like, I am being played with, and like if it's in my head, that would explain why I could still see it. Like I'm just hallucinating this thing, but everybody else sees it. But it definitely flew on a trajectory that took it behind this tree. So what the hell is going on? And then afterwards, my buddy and I were like, we definitely saw aliens. And our girlfriends were like, I don't know what we saw. Like, don't tell people you saw aliens, please. I went out to the same lake 2 weeks later, sorry, with a different group of friends and with a commitment to try and reproduce this experience intentionally by engaging in the CE5 protocols. Because like the first time I was just talking about, like, wouldn't it be funny if we saw aliens up in this particular, like if we saw a craft in this particular part of the sky, and then there it was. And I was like, what if we invite them this time? And it worked. And I go into more detail about that story on Aliens and Artists. But I think like the piece of that story that I'll leave you with that's like the most relevant piece to the conversation that we've had is that rather than it just seeming like a strange thing in the sky, I felt like it was communicating with me. And one of the things that it said to me, I mean, and we saw many of them this night. Like we stayed up and we watched the sky all night, and they would come in waves. They seemed like living things. They were like clear and like full of lights, and it felt more like looking at pond water microscopy than it did like looking at a technological device. Which is interesting, just as an aside, because Chris Bledsoe was at this conference and had started taking high resolution photos of the orbs that he has been inviting groups into, contact with. And the videos that he showed us were eerily similar in that they looked like a gastrula, like early developing embryo. Like it had every one of the videos he showed us had it's like it had a tube going from the membrane to like a core or nucleus, and then like parts floating around inside of a cytoplasm. I mean, but that extra structure, it sounds like it's like mostly like a cell, but like that extra structure made it seem like it was a ball of cells that was starting to invaginate in embryonic development, developing a gastrointestinal tract. I didn't get to ask him about it, and he's not the kind of person that would linger on these particular details. He thinks that the orbs are the souls of the dead, which, incidentally, Whitley Strieber also said that he thinks that contact is about the breaking down of the barriers between the living and the dead. I don't think the visitors have that barrier. And so this experience that I had, the communication that I got, was in part about how to geometrically formalize the paradox and solution of the paradox in a higher logical order. It was like, if you can imagine a plane defined by 3 points connected as an equilateral triangle, and say like, this is a question. And then by adding another dimension, by creating another point, which is a perspective capable of observing the plane orthogonally, then you're able to see the whole surface at once. But in so doing, you create 3 new triangles, which is like every question answered creates multiple new questions. So you've created a paradox at a higher level of order that then needs to be resolved by adding additional dimension perspectives. And I'll just connect that with a dream that I had several years later, where I was like, I file this under a contact experience, but it wasn't a waking state thing, and it wasn't, as sort of like hyper real and vivid, but nonetheless, like I don't usually have dreams with little gray men in them, but I had 2 in a row this in the spring of 2009. And one of them was a dream that there were these great forces engaged in, like, on the field of battle. And one was like humankind, and we were all, dressed in our most glorious tribal stuff, tattoos and long braided hair, and, being truly human in like the sweatiest sense. And on the other side of it were the dead. And the dead were, these beings that you see in UFO reports, like the little gray men. But like they were playing on this field, like a game like Othello, where anytime anyone was like, if the living killed the dead would become a living human being, and vice versa. Anytime the dead captured a piece, the person would become an ET. And in the middle of this like epic battle, this big storm, the sky opened up, and it was like this hyperdimensional DMT palace. And this being walked backwards like a trickster, kind of like retrograde into view, hunched over, and looked like part human and part alien. And I was like, for whatever reason, I was like, oh, that's the ghost of Terence McKenna. And the ghost of like this being showed up out of hyperspace to basically just like scorn everyone in this conflict because it was ridiculous, because you're both on the same team and there is no real divide between the living and the dead. Like, and you're going to realize that now. It was like a kind of eschatological moment, And then a couple of weeks later, I had another dream in which I encountered this. I was in a theater on the Tempe campus at the university, watching three of my friends on risers, like rehearsing for some sort of theatrical production. And all of a sudden, I had this strong sense that I should go out into the lobby, like I was being called. And I went out there, and there was this alien guy standing there who introduced himself as Malaclips the Elder and said, your three friends in there are at risk of being compromised. And I woke up and I was like, what the hell was that? Malaclips, I looked it up, was, as a word, a name I had never heard, but apparently is a figure in the like Discordian lore. It was like, there's a Malaclips the Younger and Malaclips the Elder, and it's like a warlock who ascended on a tide of blood from this great battle into the next world. I emailed my three friends and I said, look, I just had this really weird dream. I'm kind of unsettled. I feel like I have a responsibility to tell you that I received this warning. And the only one of the three that got back to me was a friend of mine who was living at the time in a studio apartment in Venice, California by himself, living a very kind of monastic lifestyle. His place didn't even have a kitchen. He had like a hot plate in the bathroom. Nobody was in his apartment. He woke up that morning and sent me a photograph of his wrist where he was missing a square of skin about 3 millimeters to a side. And I always wondered after that, like, did I get played? Like, was this, like, if I'm just going to take this in a kind of a narrative sense, was I like guarding my friends and then I got distracted by this guy and that gave him the chance to like go take a sample of my buddy while my back was turned? Or was it a genuine warning and it was just ineffectual? But in light of the other dream, you know, who's to say?
Yeah, that's right.
You asked for it, man.
Yeah, well, thank you.
I saved the weirdest stuff for later.